Hey, besides the usual greetings and whatever, also, well, complimenting Neptune for helping me, or like I should be saying, like, thanking them for helping with the project and all. You guys clearly don't want to hear a lot from me besides the actual story, so let's just get into it right now. Issei, while he was in this room, would end up finding out from his father why he exactly was here. Why his father and Ra, the sun god Ra, were here. Anubis would end up explaining that they were all here because of the fact that the three factions were planning on creating a peace treaty with the Egyptian faction, which Issei found to be rather interesting. Sezek would actually speak up right after, mentioning that they had witnessed Issei's abilities. They had even fought in wars with the Egyptian mythology as well at one point, and the Egyptian mythology was able to give them a run for their money at times before. They knew just exactly how strong the Egyptian mythology was, but they also understood that one of the main reasons why they were so strong was because of the fact that they were also practically living in a desert, which was practically, well, low on resources at times. They understood that they needed support, and when it came on to, well, the devils, fallen angels, and angels themselves, they all needed a form of support. They all needed protection. They wanted to stop senseless violence. They all wanted to have peace at this point. They understood that this would literally just be wasting resources, and they had lost so many people already due to these wars, due to all of this violence. So now they just wanted peace at this point, and they were hoping to have Issei's input in all of this as well. Well, just going by Anubis's words, because of the fact that he respected the son's decisions. Anubis figured that since Issei had been around in Japan for a while now, he should have a say in this sort of decision, this life-altering decision, considering the fact that they could either make peace with the devils, fallen angels, and angels, or like angels, devils, and fallen angels, whatever you want to call it, or they could continue this ongoing sense of violence, or something else. Issei could be the one to decide, since he was the one that was gathering all of this information and just going by Anubis's order at first, but also he ended up collecting information, learning about these people of Japan, learning about the cultures of the devils, the fallen angels, just exactly how they acted, and he had even encountered some, well, prophets from the church as well, the Christian church. So Anubis wanted to hear his son's input on all of this. Maybe he could provide something that would be insightful, maybe something that would change Anubis's mind. He was rather indifferent towards this. He didn't really know which side to pick. Right about now, he was hearing from Ra that it would be a good idea to, well, join the treaty. But at the same time, he also had others from the, well, basically this. Anubis, although he was hearing a yes from Ra, he also ended up hearing some input from others in the, well, afterlife, saying that they should not agree to this treaty with the well, Christian factions, because they felt as if they were going to be tricksters or something along those lines. They felt as if this wasn't going to be a genuine treaty, that somebody was going to break this treaty and they would just go back into chaos very soon. So Anubis wanted to hear from his son what he felt, and Issei, at the end of the day, knowing that he literally has three people who came from the Christian church become part of his, well, faction, become part of his peerage, he would actually agree without any sense of reluctance whatsoever. This would surprise Anubis, not necessarily Issei's decision, but just how easily he said yes to it. There was no sort of hesitance, which Anubis was kind of happy to hear, that his son was confident in his own decision. With this decision being made by Issei, Anubis, and Ra, they would get ready to sign the contract, or the, not necessarily contract, but treaty. But all of a sudden, well, how should I say it? The Chaos Brigade would suddenly appear out of nowhere. Kateria Leviathan would have barged into their room, and she would declare that she was going to be getting her revenge on the 4 Satans, Serzex, Seraphol, and the other 2 that weren't here for some reason. Well, unfortunately they weren't here, but they were going to kill all of these false devils, these false kings, or whatever you could call them. And that's basically how Kateria saw all of them, because of the fact that they stole her family birthright. They stole her family name and turned it into a title, something that she found to be utterly disrespectful. And she was going to get as much revenge as possible, but she would not be able to even say another word before Issei would actually just barge in and use an attack on her. Issei's attack would have been similar to, well, Agara's sand burial in a way, except, well, he's not around like a bunch of sand or anything. Well, Issei would have been the one to create the sand, how about that? Issei would suddenly summon a sandstorm. Kateria would be teleported to a sandstorm all of a sudden, and she would be confused until sand began to envelop her in a pyramid-like fashion, and from there she would end up being crushed by the sand. Issei would have showed absolutely no mercy towards Kateria, because he understood that this girl was already bad news. He had heard about these, well, ancient devils, or whatever you want to call them. He had heard about them before. They weren't all that good. They weren't all that great to be dealing with. And Issei, he would also look towards these magicians or mages, whatever you really want to call them. He just laughed at how pitiful they looked. He would immediately go on an onslaught, killing off every single last one of these mages. They would have stood absolutely no chance against Issei. Everybody would just be looking around, impressed by Issei's capabilities. They could tell where he got his power from. They could tell that this was really the son of Anubis. And there would be a person in the back watching the scene just go on, then just watching the fight go on, or like the massacre at this point. And that person would have been Vali Lucifer, the White Dragon Emperor. He was impressed. Issei was strong, really strong actually. The fact that he could just take down Kateria Leviathan as if she was nothing, that already spoke volumes towards Vali. Well, that already spoke volumes to Vali, and just letting him understand the difference in strength from everybody else in the room. Not everybody else in the room, but, well, against his Red Dragon Emperor. Looking at it now, his Red Dragon Emperor, the guy that he had to face, was relatively weak. He didn't even stand a chance against Vali. It only took a couple of blows in order to defeat the Red Dragon Emperor, and Vali felt pretty empty during that fight. It was as if this was not a destined fight whatsoever. This fight felt so pathetic in Vali's eyes, and he demanded a rematch. He wanted to fight somebody who was stronger. He could never accomplish his goals if he was just going to be given weak annoyances like that Red Dragon Emperor. He killed that guy just because of how pathetic they were. He was hoping that the cycle would continue from there on, that they would just find another host, and hopefully that new host would have been stronger than the last one. But looking at Issei now, Vali had a feeling that this guy was going to be a good replacement for the Red Dragon Emperor. This guy was going to become his new rival. He was practically declaring it at this point. He declared it in his mind, and when Issei walked back down, Vali would walk up to Issei and tap his shoulder. Well, not just tap his shoulder. He would tap his shoulder. Issei would turn to look at Vali, confused, and Vali would end up reaching out, trying to have some form of handshake be formed. He would have had his hand stretched out, and Issei would have grabbed his hand. They would have shook hands, and they would have made eye contact as well. Issei would state his name, and Vali would state his name as well. Issei would be kind of surprised hearing the fact that his last name was Lucifer, and he was wondering if he had any sort of connection to the ancient devil Lucifer. To which Vali admitted that yeah, he did. He was technically a great grandson or whatever, but he didn't really care for his family name like that. He wasn't like Kateria, as you could tell. All he was really concerned about was just getting strong, and because of that, Vali was going to declare Issei to be his new rival from here on out. Issei would have laughed at first, but he would realize that Vali wasn't laughing. He was dead serious, which intrigued Issei. Okay, this is kind of interesting. He supposed that maybe this guy could give him a challenge, especially after what Azazel ended up telling him afterwards. Azazel would end up explaining to Issei that this was apparently the White Dragon Emperor, and he had already defeated the Red Dragon Emperor rather easily. There was literally no sort of issue when it came on to fighting the Red Dragon Emperor whatsoever. It was a massacre on, well, Vali's part. The fact that he could defeat the Red Dragon Emperor so easily. It was practically like he was fighting the weakest Red Dragon Emperor in history, and Vali would agree to that. Issei would be impressed, and he would have to admit that he would maybe have to look into Vali a bit more. Maybe, just maybe, this guy could be a worthy opponent in the future. The four factions would end up finally, writing or signing the peace treaty. And from there, many other factions would become interested in this treaty, this whole peace treaty that was being made. The fact that the Egyptian faction as well even signed this treaty to begin with. One of the last factions you would ever expect to sign such a treaty. But they did, and now many others were trying to shoot their shot at in creating peace with the other factions. Nobody wants another war after all. While all of this was happening, this revolution, or you could basically call it a revolution, this new, era being created for everyone. Issei would occupy his time by actually deciding to go to the underworld one day with his, peerage. And, Asian, she would have been part of this peerage, of course. She would have been the main one running the show, besides Issei. And while down in the underworld, they would explore quite a few places. They would find the underworld to be a rather entertaining place. And they would end up learning about these fights that ended up happening, these, rating games. Sure, Issei had heard of them before, but he had never really seen one up close like this. And he found them to be rather fascinating. He could probably add that to his, into his like pastime while he was in Egypt. Maybe just see like a couple of like undead people like fight or whatever, for like fun or something along them lines. Basically like a coliseum, you could say, just a fight for Issei's entertainment from time to time. And well, there wasn't really much to do besides live in luxury, live in peace when he was up in his home in Egypt, and well, of course, study in order to become the next holder of well the balance of life and death. But Issei would also end up learning another thing while he was down in the underworld. This, of course, would end up being, well, the devil that Asya ended up saving one day. The devil that ended up getting Asya kicked out of the church. He remembered hearing this from Zenobia at one point, but he didn't necessarily know who the devil was. And now that Issei was finally getting to meet them, he did not have any sort of reaction whatsoever. As a matter of fact, Theodora wouldn't even really acknowledge Issei. Instead, he would go straight for Asya, interestingly enough. This would have been the one that kind of ticked Issei off, but he would digress. He would try and keep a level head for this moment, and Theodora, he would mention how he was the devil that Asya had saved all so many years ago. He never got the chance to thank Asya for saving him all those years back. He really appreciated their help, and in return, he wanted to marry her. The fact that she was so gracious, she had such a kind heart. He would just start spewing a whole bunch of lovey-dovey stuff in order to win Asya's heart. But in this timeline, she did not buy any of it. Now, she would actually reject his offer immediately. She would explain that she had no interest in Theodora whatsoever. She was perfectly fine with Issei, and Theodora would be kind of upset hearing this. And he would look up to Issei, wondering what he had over him. Issei, noticing that this guy wouldn't accept no for an answer, he would decide to kick it up a notch. He would ask Asya a question. This question would be whether she hated this guy or not. Asya would explain that she actually did not hate Theodora for what happened so many years ago. She did not have any sort of grudge against him whatsoever. Issei would ask her another question. Do you regret saving him? Do you regret meeting me? More so. Do you regret saving Theodora? And do you regret meeting me as a result of those years of suffering that you had to go through? Asya would explain that if she could go back and change anything in order to make sure that she had a better life, and within the church more specifically, she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't change a thing. If she could go back in time right now, she would not change a thing because of the fact that she admired Issei. She respected Issei to a fault. She appreciated Issei for everything that he did for her. He took her in when nobody else would. He actually gave her a welcoming home, unlike the fallen angels at the time, who only ever tried to use her. And the fact that she ended up learning about how, well, the biblical God was dead and all, this was crazy to her. But she noticed that the church was basically a cult, and Issei was her savior, her knight in shining armor. So of course she would not regret having met Issei. She did not even regret saving Theodora. And hearing all of this, Theodora would still be rather upset, but he would just look towards Issei and Issei would just fold his arms. He would exude an aura of confidence, and this confidence would be overwhelming for, well, Theodora. It was literally as if Issei's willpower was being forced down Theodora's throat. It was practically forcing him to kneel before Issei. Theodora was practically about to kneel, but at the last moment he would just decide to walk away. He refused to kneel down to Issei. He knew about Issei's status, but he still felt as if him being a devil was worth more than anything that Issei ever was. Just because he was the son of Anubis didn't mean anything to Theodora. It was just the fact that he could not touch Issei right now. If he dared touch Issei, then he did not know what the consequences could be. He did not want to face somebody of Anubis' caliber. He didn't know how strong Issei was, but he had heard the stories of Anubis, and that was frightening to Theodora. The fact that Issei could even bestow it, and the fact that Issei could even force his will onto others like that was unnerving to Theodora. Loki wouldn't have dared trying to, well, attack Odin at this point. After finding out that Odin, of like the Norse mythology, the Norse faction, was coming down to meet the devils in order to make a peace treaty with them. Well, Loki was planning on going to kill Odin and create Ragnarok, kickstart Ragnarok, but after finding out that, well, Anubis was going to be there as well in order to help proceed, well, the treaty, Loki, he would immediately realize that that was going to be a foolish move. He knew just exactly how strong Anubis was. Everybody knew how strong Anubis was. Everybody knew how strong Ra was. Everybody knew how strong the Egyptian mythology was. Nobody wanted to have any sort of smoke like that. Sure, there was some factions that could probably take on the Egyptian mythology, but at the same time, nobody wanted to go through such bloodshed again. That was the biggest issue out of all of it. And of course, at the end, well, Issei would have been in the middle of everything as well. Issei would have been a rather powerful individual. He inherited practically everything from his father and more. And Issei was only ever growing in strength every single day, so everybody would be rather alert. Theodora was one of the very few to step out of line while Issei was down in, well, the underworld, just exploring the place. And when Issei left, he would have ended up finding out about this sort of field trip that was going to be happening. They were going to be going to not Cool Academy, but they were going to be going to, well, they were going to be going to Kyoto. Man, I don't know why it took me so long. They were basically going to be going to Kyoto for a while. And while in Kyoto, Issei would end up having to battle against the, well, hero faction. Apparently, they ended up kidnapping the yokai Fox Queen. And, well, her name was Shisaka. Issei knew about the yokai. Well, a little bit. He wasn't all that versed in them, but he understood that they had rather strong members, so Issei would have done his best against the hero faction. Plus, he also wanted these guys to join the peace treaty. He wanted everybody to join this peace treaty at this point. He didn't want to fight anybody anymore. He just wanted to live a life of comfort and knowledge. That's all Issei really asked for at this point. And he would have even had his, well, faction members, Irina, Zenobia, and Asya, all deal with the hero faction members as well. the great number of hero faction members. They would have all managed to kill a bunch of hero faction members, and the craziest part about it all was the fact that each and every last one of these hero faction members would have been teleported to, well, the gates of judgment, or basically where Anubis would be judging you from here on out. Somebody would have been in place of Anubis for a while, but they would have done the job rather well. They would have balanced their hearts with a feather, and most of the hero faction members' hearts, they would have been heavier than a feather, meaning that their sins were far too much for this world, far too evil, and of course they would have ended up in a stone. They would have ended up as if they would have ended up in a bad situation, to say the very least. They would have ended up, well, turning into stone. Some of them would have turned into stone, while others, they would have ended up having to suffer the wrath of Anubis tenfold. They would have ended up going through an eternal amount of agony. And at the end, well, Issei would have just been left with Cao Cao. Cao Cao would have looked around and realized that practically all of his men were defeated in a matter of moments. And Cao Cao would admit that he had been color impressed. He was rather impressed with Issei's, well, peerage members, but how strong was Issei, the son of Anubis? He had heard many stories about Anubis, and he had heard some about Issei as well. But as far as he was concerned, that's all they ever were, stories. He wanted to know what the real thing was like. He wanted to test out Issei's strength and see just how comparable a human was to a god. Their battle would be very one-sided. Yeah, I'm sorry, but Issei would just not be in a mood to really be fighting this guy, and instead Issei would just summoned a shadow. Why am I saying shadow army so many times? He would have summoned an undead army of soldiers to just wear down Cao Cao, while in the middle of fighting all of these undead zombies, these undead soldiers of Issei. Issei would have noticed that Cao Cao was beginning to wear down, and he would have also used this opportunity in order to make a beeline for him. He would have grabbed onto Cao Cao's face at one point, and Cao Cao, he would have tried to rip Issei's hand off of his face, but Issei would have begun to absorb the moisture from Cao Cao. Eventually, he would be left in a corpse-like state, completely dried out and hollow. The army of Issei's, this undead army, would disappear right after. Issei would admit that he wasn't really in the mood for fighting. As a matter of fact, what Issei ended up doing was just distracting Cao Cao and draining his energy as time went by, until Issei found a good time to, well, kill him. And from there, Issei wouldn't be all that concerned with the hero faction anymore. Instead, Issei would have let word be known that Cao Cao, the leader of the hero faction, was dead, and now that he was dead, that meant that the hero faction had to depart, or they could continue fighting. They could continue to fight for another day, but considering that the strongest member was dead, then how much more time did they really think they had? Issei would also end up rescuing Yasaka, and while there, Issei would end up recruiting Yasaka into his peerage as well, because of the fact that she was strong. And Yasaka, she had a bit of a liking towards Issei. She also had to admit that when it came on to the Egyptian mythology, if she became part of, well, Issei's peerage, that could practically mean an eternal protection for her faction as well. Which Issei would admit that she wasn't completely wrong, because, well, he could technically have some soldiers there to protect him at any time. They didn't really take that much energy out of Issei to maintain whatsoever. It was practically non-existent for how much energy he had to use in order to preserve these soldiers. It took more energy out of Issei in order to reform them, if anything. And even then, he could increase the strength of these soldiers at any time. These weren't even the elites of his army that he used most of the time, but they were still rather resilient. That's only if he really wanted to have them be resilient though. If anything, he could send in like the absolute weakest and they could still get the job done of protecting well, the yokai faction. But Issei would be rather generous. He would give them some of the elites, some of the strongest, in order to help them go by. But especially after hearing what Issei did to South Town, it wouldn't even really be necessary. These guys wouldn't even have to fight anymore. All they had to do was just keep watch. Issei would have practically made Kyoto part of his territory at this point. And many people who thought that they were going to fight against Anubis and Issei, after finding out what happened to their leader, they would have quickly disbanded as well. Nobody wanted to deal with this amount of danger that came from the Egyptian mythology. Issei would continue to rack up more peerage members, and he would also become stronger as well. Eventually, Issei would become the next ruler of the dead, technically. He would end up taking over his father's role in the Egyptian mythology eventually. And that's basically it. He would have taken over the Egyptian mythology. The Egyptian mythology is undead. Not undead, but afterlife. He would have ended up taking over the afterlife from his father, and he would have ended up having to deal with more people from different factions wanting to join his peerage as well. Not only that, but he would have ended up making quite a bit of allies as time continued to go by, and more factions would begin to ally with Issei's own. They would have ended up establishing a form of peace, and Issei would have lived in luxury, this sort of luxury that he had been dying for. But he would also just explore the world. His father had made him interested in exploring the world at this point, after his whole thing in, Japan for a while, just learning about this severely different culture. And now Issei was content with life. He also had a couple of kids with some of his peerage members. And they were terrifying, to say the very least. Especially Yasaka's kid. She already had a daughter beforehand, but now that she ended up having another kid, but this time it was with Issei, the ruler of the dead, the guy who controlled the afterlife for Egyptians, and the fact that anybody who ended up being killed by an Egyptian god or somebody related to an Egyptian god would be sent over to the Egyptian graveyard, the Egyptian afterlife, the Egyptian judgment. That made things even more terrifying with how powerful their kid would be, because of the fact that they had control over that, and they had control over some of the abilities that Yasaka already had. So yes, Issei would be very strong, live a happy life, and his fox kid would end up becoming the next heir to the throne, because they were the most powerful out of all of them. And yeah, that's all I gotta say. You guys already know the deal. If you like the video, be sure to give it a like. If you've been rocking my content for a while, maybe hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and maybe share as well. But beyond that, that's all I gotta really say. Time climbing to working time. Next sign out. Peace.